Walter White is often seen as one of television's most brilliant anti-heroes. A high school chemistry teacher turned drug kingpin, he manipulated, schemed, and strategized his way to the top of the meth world. But for all his intelligence, Walter White was far from perfect. In fact, some of his decisions were downright stupid. Some of these errors were minor miscalculations, while others were catastrophic blunders that cost lives, money, and ultimately his empire. One of Walt's earliest and most avoidable mistakes was refusing financial help from Gretchen and Elliot Schwartz. These were his former business partners at Gray Matter Technologies, the company he helped build before leaving due to personal issues. They were now billionaires, and when they learned of his cancer, they generously offered to pay for his treatment. But Walt's pride wouldn't allow it. He had walked away from Gray Matter years ago, believing he had been cheated out of success. The idea of taking their charity now, after they had become billionaires without him, was too much for his ego to handle. But let's be real, this was an absolutely ridiculous decision. Accepting the money would have paid for his treatment, possibly saving his life, kept his family together, since Skylar would have had no reason to be suspicious, prevented him from entering the drug trade, avoiding all the disasters that followed. Instead, Walt chose to manufacture and sell an extremely dangerous drug, which put him, his family, and countless others in danger, all because he couldn't swallow his ego. Now, even if we accept that Walt was determined to cook meth, his next mistake was his choice of business partner. Jesse Pinkman was a small-time meth cook, but he was also an unreliable, immature addict. From the start, Jesse made poor business decisions, got high on his own supply, and failed to manage even a small-scale operation. If Walt had been truly smart, he would have found a more competent partner, someone who understood how to move product without attracting the wrong attention. But instead, he chose Jesse because he thought he could control him, a mistake that would lead to numerous conflicts in the seasons to come. One of Walt's first major encounters with the criminal underworld came when he and Jesse were forced to deal with Crazy 8 and Emilio, two local drug dealers who wanted to steal their meth recipe. When Walt used phosphine gas to kill them inside the RV, he believed the problem was solved, until he realized that Crazy 8 survived. What followed was one of the most agonizingly stupid mistakes Walt made early on. Instead of eliminating Crazy 8 immediately, Walt kept him alive, convinced himself that maybe he could let him go, and even made a pros and cons list about whether he should kill him. Of course, Crazy 8 was never going to let Walt live. He was biding his time, waiting for an opportunity. Walt only realized this after he saw that Crazy 8 had grabbed a piece of a broken plate to use as a weapon. Walt then had to kill him anyway, but by hesitating, he put himself and Jesse in unnecessary danger, made the kill much harder on himself mentally, created a messier situation than necessary. Had he handled it cleanly from the start, it would have been a quick and efficient solution. But Walt's hesitation, his unwillingness to accept the consequences of his choices, nearly got him killed before his criminal career had even begun. By season 2, Walt's operation was growing, but so were his mistakes. His inability to think beyond the short term caused catastrophic consequences, and his selfishness started affecting the lives of people he didn't even know. One of his biggest dumb mistakes was letting Jane Margolis die. Now, some might argue that this was a strategic move. Jane was blackmailing him after all, but Walt didn't kill her. He simply stood there and watched her choke on her own vomit. This is where the stupidity of his decision comes in. Walt had no way of predicting the fallout of letting Jane die. He thought he was solving a small problem, but instead he accidentally triggered one of the worst tragedies in Breaking Bad, the Wayfarer 515 mid-air collision. Jane's father, Donald Margolis, was an air traffic controller. Overcome with grief, he made a critical mistake at work, causing 2 planes to crash over Albuquerque. The result? 167 people dead. This entire disaster could have been avoided if Walt had simply handled the Jesse situation differently. Instead, his cold decision-making led to mass death, and he didn't even realize how much damage he had done until he saw the wreckage from his backyard. Walt couldn't have predicted that his inaction would cause a disaster of this scale, but that's exactly the point. His reckless decisions had consequences far beyond what he imagined. By refusing to consider the long-term impact of his actions, He inadvertently became responsible for one of the worst tragedies in the show's universe. Another dumb decision in season 2, telling Jesse to sell meth to recovering addicts in rehab. This was one of the most reckless business moves Walt ever made. Not only was it morally awful, but it also risked bringing law enforcement attention to their operation. Even Jesse, who had made plenty of dumb choices himself, refused to go through with it, realizing how morally disgusting and business stupid the idea was. This was an early sign that Jesse was growing as a person, while Walt was becoming more ruthless and careless. By the time season 3 begins, Walter White has already made several terrible decisions that nearly got him killed. But now he's no longer just a small-time meth cook. He's stepping into the big leagues. His operation expands, and with it, so do his stupid choices, each one pushing him closer to disaster. One of the biggest was his decision to work for Gus Fring in the first place. At the time, Walt thought this was the best move for his business. Gus was professional, organized, and offered him millions of dollars. But what Walt failed to realize was that Gus never trusted him. He underestimated how dangerous Gus was. Walt had already killed before, but he had never dealt with someone as calculating as Fring. Gus didn't make emotional decisions, he made strategic ones. From the very beginning, Gus was grooming Gail Bedecker as a replacement. And here's where Walt's stupidity really comes into play. Instead of outsmarting Gus, he made one of his most desperate and reckless decisions. He forced Jesse to murder Gail. At this point, Gus was phasing Walt out. Gail was ready to take over the lab, which meant Walt was as good as dead. But instead of trying to negotiate, or at least come up with a more intelligent plan, Walt panicked and told Jesse to kill Gail before Gus could kill them. While it saved them in the short term, it only made things worse because it solidified Jesse's trauma, making him even more unstable. Jesse had never killed anyone before, and this shattered his psyche. It escalated the war between Walt and Gus. Walt didn't just kill a replacement cook. He declared war on a man who was far smarter, richer, and more powerful than him. It made Walt look desperate and sloppy. Instead of controlling the situation, he reacted in a panic, showing Gus that he was willing to do anything to survive. If Walt had played it smarter, he could have outmaneuvered Gus another way. Instead, he made himself an even bigger target. Season 4 is when Walt is at war with Gus Fring, and while Walt eventually comes out on top, it's not because he was the smartest player, it's because he was the most reckless. He made one dumb decision after another, barely surviving each time. One of the biggest mistakes Walt ever made was admitting to Skyler that he was a drug dealer. Let's break this down. At this point, Skyler wasn't even close to figuring it out. She had suspicions, but she wasn't sure. Instead of denying everything, Walt arrogantly confessed. He did it in the most dramatic way possible. "I am the danger. I am the one who knocks." While it made for an iconic moment, it was objectively stupid. By telling Skyler, he gave her power over him. She hated him. She wanted him out of the house. And later, she would be the one to help Hank take him down. A smarter move would have been keeping her in the dark for as long as possible, or convincing her that it was all under control. But Walt's ego wouldn't allow that. He wanted to be feared, and all it did was give Skyler more reason to work against him.